being here with me this evening. My name is Theodora Schiro, like Julianne said, and I go by Theo, but I'm not really in New Mexico. I'm in Arizona, just so that you know. We're neighbors, but it's still all the Southwest. Before I get started, I want to mention that if our conversation tonight is a trigger for you or makes you uncomfortable, you can call the Crisis Services Canada that I looked up. I hope this is the correct number, 1-833-456-4566. If you haven't already, I recommend that you add that number to your phone contacts. If you're a survivor of suicide loss, you never know when others are going to come up to you and ask you for advice. So if you give them that crisis number, that can be helpful to them. I noticed that the program for tonight, the description is in English and in French. I wish I could tell this story in both languages for you. I grew up in a Foreign Service family and we lived in several different countries. I actually spoke fluent French as a child and a teenager. I even remember helping my French teacher teach class in junior high in Virginia. But shortly after that, we moved to Germany. And because I had to learn German to attend a German school, sadly, I didn't keep up with my French for very long and I lost it. So I can't say this in both languages. But on to the reason that I'm here now. Nobody had ever asked me to talk about my journey with grief until my friend Aline suggested that I visit your group. So I've been thinking a lot about what I would say to you. And I hope that what I share with you will help you to heal from your own loss and show you that there is a light at the end of that dark tunnel you have to pass through. My story is a story of loss and recovery, and it's more about love than loss. Between 2011 and 2019, I lost my son, my mother, my father, and my daughter, in that order. I'll tell you about my children in a few minutes, but I don't want to forget about my parents. They moved from Virginia to Arizona in January of 2011, not by choice, but by necessity. My mother suffered from Alzheimer's, and my father had fallen and injured his leg, which left him in a wheelchair, so he really couldn't be much help to my mom. So my siblings and I agreed that a warmer climate and an assisted living arrangement would be much safer for them than the old farmhouse they were living in Virginia. So I found an assisted living facility close to where I live, and I was able to care for them during their final years. My mom passed in January of 2012, and for her, it must have been a relief because her real self has been gone for a long time. I know if you know others that have suffered from that disease, what it's like. She was such a kind and loving lady. I always think of her as an angel person. She didn't deserve to live with that illness and not know what was going on around her. My father stayed around for a little while longer, but he passed away on the exact same date as my mom in January of 2014, 2 years later. He was a brilliant man, a former diplomat, and later an activist for world peace. He was a published author who wrote 4 books and even had a book written about his life and accomplishments by a German colleague. He didn't retire until he was 84, I think. My father, I always thought of him as a walking encyclopedia because he knew everything. He had to endure not only that physical, but mental decline during his final years. It must have been horrible for him to experience too. So I'm pretty sure he actually looked forward to joining my mom and his other family members on the other side. So that's my parents' part of the story. Their deaths were not unexpected. And while they're still make me sad, they're a lot different from the deaths of my children. Let me tell you a little bit about my family. My husband, Steve, and I got married in 1984. We had our first child, Rihanna, in 1986, and our son, Jonathan, who we called Joss, in 1989. After Rihanna was born, Steve and I remember that we looked at each other and we marveled at how we could just feel such a powerful love for that baby. And like so many young parents, we took immense pleasure in her every accomplishment, every step that she made, every change that she went through. I know that if you've experienced the birth of a child and watched them grow, you know that feeling too. You know what I'm talking about. Then when the second child came along, we wondered how we were going to be able to spread that love out to include another baby. Well, it turned out there was plenty of love to go around, and we had that same intense love for Joss too. That's why I'm telling you this is a story about love too. We didn't have a lot of money, or a lot of sense sometimes, but we were a happy family. We moved around the country a few times. We moved from Arizona, where my husband and I met, to Louisiana, to Massachusetts, and eventually settled back in Arizona in a suburb of Phoenix called Mesa. The children were still pretty little when we got back to Arizona. Rihanna started first grade and Joss was in preschool. I got a teaching job at a public school near our house after Joss started kindergarten. I took both kids to school with me. Around that same time, Steve decided to change careers and he went to the local university to get his teaching degree. And he eventually joined us at the same elementary school to do his student teaching. So all four of us were at that same school together. It was kind of fun, a little family school. He eventually did get a teaching job at another school in Mesa. But Rihanna and Joss, they both enjoyed school. They were good students. They were both enrolled in the gifted program and they were excelling academically. They just loved to learn. When Joss was in 5th grade, about 10, I guess, that's when the first sign of trouble appeared. I remember him telling me once that he wanted to die. A 10-year-old, he told me he wanted to die. I told the counselor who worked at the school part-time about what he had said, but the counselor never got around to talking to Joss. He didn't have time. He gave me this little pink card with emergency numbers on it. I still remember what it looks like. And that was it. And Joss didn't mention it again for several years. I didn't ever forget about it, but I didn't really feel a sense of urgency about addressing those feelings. Looking back, I wish I had. In the spring of 2011, Joss died by suicide. He was 21. As you all know, any sudden death is a shock, and we were devastated. We blamed ourselves. Since we were both teachers, we felt like we should have seen those warning signs and been able to prevent our son's death. Joss was about to graduate from Arizona State University. He had degrees in both psychology and biology, which they actually awarded to him posthumously. He was a passionate and brilliant student. He loved learning. He was fascinated by brain research he was doing. I think that was partly because he wanted to understand his own mental illness. He wasn't ready to start his career as a scientist yet. He wanted to continue his studies of neuroscience, and he planned on staying at the university for a dual degree, master's and doctoral program. When he was little, growing up, he had a curious mind. To him, information was the key to life. I remember when he was in high school, if he came across an interesting topic, he would just research it until his curiosity was satisfied. And then he'd come in and share what he found out with us. He'd go into these long, detailed explanations about how things worked or why people behaved as they did. I think he could analyze every movie that was ever made. I wish he were around sometimes so I could ask him questions about movies that I see. He was a smart, funny, and kind kid. He was very tall and handsome, very tall. He was 6'5". So I don't know how you say that in metrics. I think I looked it up. It was 1.96 meters. I'm just barely over 5 feet. So he's way tall, but he was also very troubled. He felt socially awkward. Transitions were really hard for him, from elementary school to middle school, and then middle school to high school to college. Those were very difficult changes for him. When he went to the university, most kids, when they go to the university, they can't wait to leave home, but he preferred to commute to class because the idea of living in a dorm was just too uncomfortable. And looking back, I think that each of those transitions triggered his anxiety disorder, which we did not understand at the time was a mental health issue. Now we know that was the problem, but we didn't know that until later. Sometimes Joss suffered these bouts of depression that were so deep he couldn't even get out of bed for days. We didn't understand his behavior. We didn't see it as an illness, but we realized he needed help. We encouraged him to get counseling and go to a psychiatrist, but he just refused. No matter, I even looked up, I remember looking up pages and pages of different providers that he could go to, but he just wouldn't do it. Eventually, he agreed to go to the family doctor who prescribed medication, which did seem to help his depression, but the doctor didn't provide any other treatment or counseling for him. Well, we really didn't see this coming. As graduation from Arizona State University was getting closer and another major transition loomed, as I'm listening to myself talk, I'm thinking we should have recognized that that transition was going to be a problem, but we really didn't take action. But leaving school and getting a job seemed overwhelming for Joss. He was dreading the end of his work there in the neurology research lab and the loss of his friends. He had made some very close friends there. I think the first time in his life he had his first girlfriend then too. But he took his life just a few weeks before his senior year was over. He must have planned his departure for a while. During the weeks before his death, he gave away some of his prized possessions to his friends. He joined us on family outings when in the past he would prefer to stay home. He started spending more time than usual with his grandparents who had moved here by then and with us. He stopped taking his medication, which I think we kind of knew, but we were watching him and he seemed like he was cheerful and optimistic and we thought he was feeling okay. We had no idea he was in the process of saying goodbye to his family and friends. On March 28th, 2011, he left the planet. The warning signs were all there, but we just hadn't recognized them. So I can tell you that the shock and grief that we felt after our son's death was unbearable. We did not understand why Joss wanted to die, and we blamed ourselves for not having prevented it. It seems like that's not uncommon for survivors of suicide loss. So I imagine that you probably know how that feels if you're one of us. So in our search for answers, we read a lot of books and we looked for information online. We learned that suicide can result from depression or other mental health conditions. You'd think we would have known that, but I don't think it ever registered. We never thought about suicide happening to us. We thought about that happened to other people. Anyway, we worked with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, called AFSP, as volunteers, and we participated in activities to increase awareness about suicide and stop the stigma that keeps people from addressing mental illness and suicide. As educators and parents, we want other parents and teachers to know what we wish we had known before it was too late. The more we learned about how youth suicide could be prevented, the more we became involved in advocacy work with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I'll call them AFSP from now, it's a little bit shorter. I think they have a similar organization in Canada. But we helped to pass the first legislation in Arizona addressing educating school personnel in suicide prevention. And with support from AFSP and MPACT, the local suicide prevention agency, we continue to provide training to teachers, staff, parents, and students in schools all across Arizona and most recently out of state. So on our road to recovery, our work with AFSP and MPACT has really been instrumental in our healing. We learned so much about suicide prevention and advocacy, and we made lifelong friendships with a lot of the volunteers in our community. I think I mentioned that Canada has a similar organization. I found the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention. So I hope they are doing some similar things to AFSP. We found that working with others who had lost loved ones to suicide helped us to begin the process of recovery. So we did that for, I think, 4 or 5 years. We worked with AFSP. But along with the support that we received from those prevention organizations, we talked to a grief counselor. We went to a very helpful 12-week grief recovery class, which required homework. But one of the most profound experiences in our recovery was a session with a gifted medium, someone who can communicate with the spirits of loved ones who have passed away. And before you start thinking I might be a little nuts, just listen to what happened. Not everyone believes in the metaphysical. I do, but Steve was a staunch skeptic. He only agreed to go with me to see this medium just to be nice to me, to try to make me feel better. But he was convinced by the time we finished that the messages that she shared with us were absolutely genuine. The first reading with her, with the medium, was astounding. Joss was invisible, of course, but we had absolutely no doubt he was in the room with us. Through the medium, he told us that he had a bipolar disorder with major depression. We didn't know about that bipolar disorder part, and we had to look that up. Joss believed that death was the only way to end his pain. He said he was happy on the other side. He was learning a lot. He was spending time with relatives who had already crossed over. By that time, my mom had also passed, so he was hanging out with her. I think they had tea parties together. He apologized repeatedly for hurting us so much. He even told us that he should have agreed to see a counselor to treat his illness while he was with us. But over the years, we've gone back for more readings, and they're always comforting and encouraging. We've learned to recognize the little messages that Joss sends to remind us that he's nearby. And even though we'll never truly recover from his sudden death, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about him. There is great comfort in knowing that he's much happier now. His spirit is still with us, and we visit with him often. Now, every time that a friend or a colleague experiences the sudden and unexpected loss of a loved one, I tell them about all the ways that AFSP provides resources and support if the death was by suicide. If it wasn't, obviously I don't mention AFSP, but I also recommend a grief recovery class. It helps to find closure. Then I mention the visit to a reputable medium, that it will be enlightening. They don't even usually roll their eyes or walk away, believe it or not. They usually just ask me to recommend a good medium. It's been 10 years now since we lost our only son. We continue to increase awareness and educate others, knowing that a lot of educators want more resources to help create prevention plans. I put everything that we learn into a comprehensive handbook for schools. As a former educator and school administrator, I hope that my book will help school leaders understand how to prevent suicide. It was just published in the spring of 2020. Here it is, the book itself, A Culture of Caring, a Suicide Prevention Guide for Schools, K-12. It's still available for sale if anybody knows a school that could use one. Also, if you want to know more about suicide prevention, you can visit my website, which is theodoraschiro.com, and there are a lot of resources there for anyone who's interested in prevention. Now, about my other loss. When you lose a child, you never expect to have to experience that loss a second time. But we did. Our daughter, Rihanna, was killed in a car accident 2 years ago in 2019. She was 32. I struggled to deal with her loss every day, not only because I miss her terribly, but because she had led such a very difficult life for a long time, and I wish I could have helped her more. Rihanna attended law school in Virginia, 3,000 miles from our home in Arizona. She stayed there for a while, I think a couple of years after she graduated, getting ready to take the bar exam. During that time, she was very slow to respond to our emails, phone calls, or text messages. She rarely initiated communication unless she needed something. And we were kind of used to that behavior. She's always been a private person and rarely shared much about her life with us, but this particular communication gap was extreme. And I started getting concerned that something wasn't right with her. When she stopped responding entirely, I started to get really worried. So after too many days without any response, I got on a plane and went to Virginia to find out what was going on. I rented a car at the airport and drove to her apartment. She was home, and when she saw me, she said she was surprised to see me, even though I had sent multiple messages telling her I was on my way. Her apartment was a disaster. Not that she'd ever been a tidy person, but what I saw was absolute squalor. I'll leave it to your imagination to picture what that must have looked like. She had 2 greyhounds living with her. If you've seen greyhounds, they're big dogs. One was huge, almost a foot taller than her other dog, who was no shorty herself. There was no floor space showing in that apartment. Somehow those dogs just navigated through the piles of stuff, and they commandeered the couch, which was the only place to sit, for most of the time I was there. I remember having to shove them over so I could have a place to sit while I was visiting. Anyway, I stayed there for a few weeks, helping to get the place cleaned up and spending time with my daughter. We really had a good time together. And when I left, I thought she might be okay. But I was wrong. It turned out that that was the first of several unplanned visits that I made to Virginia. She shut down communication with us several times after that first trip. Each time we knew it meant trouble. I went out and cleaned up her place, and with Steve's help, moved her to a larger apartment in another town. I was hoping that giving her more space would help her organize her stuff, but of course that didn't happen. Anyway, that's a different story. But by that time, Rihanna had suffered the humiliation of not passing the bar exam. The first time in her life she had ever experienced a major failure. But she wanted to try again. She wanted to keep studying and try again. Let me tell you about the real Rihanna. This was a girl who had graduated from the Arizona State University in the top 40 out of her class of 8,000 students. She was accepted by all 6 top-tier law schools that she applied to several years later. That girl was brilliant, motivated, and destined for success. When she was a senior in college, she did a semester abroad at the University of Ghana and then stayed in Africa for another 6 months to work as an intern with the UN in Sierra Leone, which she organized entirely on her own. During the years between graduation from the university and before she went to law school, Rihanna morphed into an amazing teacher. Even though she said she never was going to be a teacher because her parents were teachers, she was awesome. She must have been genetic somehow. But she got a job in South Korea teaching English to students in grades kindergarten all the way to 12th grade, shortly after she graduated from the university. And when she came home, she worked as a substitute teacher in Arizona in my school district. And during those in-between years between college and being back here and overseas again, she traveled the world. She lived in Bangladesh for a year. She visited Asian and European countries all on her own by herself, exploring the world and building her resume so she could get the right job as a lawyer. After graduating from law school, she started tutoring online so that she could earn a living working from home while she was studying for the bar exam. That girl could teach children and young adults all the way from kindergarten to postgraduates. I used to hear her when she was living with us doing these lessons. She was amazing. And she advocated for every one of these kids. She taught the little ones to read. She encouraged parents to get them tested if they indicated that they had learning difficulties. And she kept her thumb on those teens who couldn't graduate from high school without help, whipped them into shape when they neglected their studies. She taught history to high school students who were trying to get ready for the SAT exams. And she even helped graduate students pass the LSAT, which is the test to get into law school. She built long-term relationships with a lot of her students. Some of these relationships went on for years, and even some of the parents. Somehow she did all of that online without ever meeting her students in person, except one of them. She tutored this girl who lived in a dysfunctional household in California. And she worked with that girl, I think 3 or 4 years. When the student was worried that she wouldn't be able to graduate if she couldn't pass her senior exams, Rihanna invited her to stay with her in Virginia for 2 weeks so she could tutor her in person without distractions. And since her family couldn't afford it, they sent her. Besides being a talented teacher, Rihanna was an organizer too. Even though she might not have organized her own environment, that girl could organize events for other people down to the last detail, from weddings to birthday parties to memorial services. She especially liked creating the decorations. For my father's memorial service, she made these origami flower arrangements. I don't know how, she must have made hundreds of these flowers out of the actual music sheets my father had used when he played his accordion. And then she accented them with these tiny little silver dangling pigs in my mother's memory. My mother liked pigs. She collected them so that it was a way to recognize both parents. She, or in her case, her grandparents. She planned her best friend's wedding from start to finish. And she helped organize my brother's wedding in Arizona while she was living in Bangladesh. And those are just a few examples of her unique organizational talents. But Rihanna had an invisible illness that was hiding in plain sight. After she failed to pass the Virginia bar exam, I realized that her lack of communication really was caused by the fact that she was struggling with demons inside her head and she couldn't find her way out. It turned out that she was very, very ill. During my third visit to Virginia, she admitted that she needed professional help, and she ended up with diagnoses of anxiety, depression, PTSD, OCD, and a few other conditions. She'd been reluctant to seek treatment because of the cost, and maybe because she just didn't want to have to dig into her own psyche. Not long after that last visit, Rihanna agreed that she could no longer manage on her own and she'd come back to Arizona to live with us. We hoped that living in our peaceful rural home would help her recover. And during the 18 months she lived with us, she seemed to be gradually improving. She still refused to get professional help after she moved home, though. She said she could manage without it. And because we lived in a rural area, access to mental health care is non-existent. And she didn't want to drive into the nearest city, which is an hour and a half one way, or to work with a therapist online. But her mental health gradually started to get better. She passed the Arizona bar exam, and that was a great accomplishment. A job opportunity came up that would have been a perfect fit for her as a lawyer teacher. She would have been a lawyer for a school district advocate, and she was considering taking a position that was offered to her in school law. But one day, not long after that whole opportunity was getting started, she was on her way to take her dog to the vet. Now, I mentioned we live in a rural area. Our house is just off of a dirt road where there's not very much traffic. So if you drive down that road, sometimes I've driven half an hour and not seen another vehicle. It's not a lot of traffic there. But she was on her way to take the dog to the vet. She got distracted and she ran head on into an oncoming vehicle. She was not suicidal. We'd had that conversation several times. It really was just a tragic accident. She'd forgotten to buckle her seatbelt and she died instantly when her head hit the windshield. The dog survived and she now lives with us. She's here. I think she's right behind me. I don't know if you can see her or not, Matilda. But remember the medium that we visited after Joss died? Through her, Rihanna told us that she had been leaning into the back seat like this, trying to get something for the dog, and she didn't see the truck coming towards her until it was too late. So that's kind of how we know what happened. After Rihanna died in that car accident, along with all the other emotions I was feeling, I also worried that I should have been a better mother and tried harder to get her illness under control. And for the 2 years since her death, I've battled with those conflicting emotions of loss, grief, guilt, and everything else that goes along with that. But just recently, I think it was this summer, not long after the second anniversary of her death, I finally signed up to see a therapist online. And after just a few sessions, I had a much better understanding of my feelings, and that has helped me a lot. I learned that being engaged with life is the best way to overcome grief. A good analogy is to think about ocean waves, like if you're at the beach. If you walk out into the water, a big wave can come up and hit you, catching you off guard at any time. A big wave of grief can do that to you too. So you can choose to let it crash into you and knock you down, or you can try to go over it or under it. The point is, you can't fight that wave. It's going to come, but you can accept it and deal with it. I learned that to feel different, you have to do something different. You have to engage with other people. You have to take control of your own life. If you were to ask me for advice about how to deal with your loss, I would share what I've learned from others along my journey, from my father. I was a born optimist, and I remember my father telling me right after my son died not to lose my positive attitude and cheerful nature. Well, as you already know, I've always considered him to be one of the wisest people in the world, and I remind myself to honor his request That has anchored me and helped me survive the loss of both of my children. Advice from a friend: don't think about how your loved one died, but instead, when those thoughts start to surface, just try to exchange them for positive memories and be grateful for the time that you had to spend together. I think about how much I loved my children, how kind and loving they were, how much they knew and understood about the world around them, and how much I learned from them. What I learned from my husband. People sometimes ask us how our marriage survived the loss of not one, but both children. The answer is that we loved each other in the beginning, and that hasn't changed. We may have drifted away from each other here and there a little before Joss died because, just because we were involved in our own careers, but we've never blamed each other for not doing the right thing or for contributing to the problems that led to our sons or our daughters' deaths. We understand that we each grieve differently. In fact, I think that the shared experience of going through these losses has brought us closer. We both agree on that. Advice from our medium, not a psychic. Don't call her that. She doesn't like being called a psychic. She taught us a great deal about spirituality. Although Steve was raised as a Catholic and my parents were Episcopalian, we were not very religious and we don't belong to any church. But we learned about the spirit on the other side from Melinda, and we have found a lot of comfort knowing that Joss and Rihanna often spend time with my mother and father and with Steve's mother. Rihanna was learning to cook from her grandmother, so last time we visited with her, Rihanna also told us that she was much happier over there than she had been here on Earth. So I've learned that it's okay to engage in life. I've been doing lots of different things over the past 2 years since Rihanna died. I write a lot as an author and as a freelance writer. I joined a Toastmasters club to improve my presentation skills. I've gotten involved in local politics as a volunteer, and I've been working with an organization of parents who've lost children to suicide to create and publish a documentary film about surviving suicide loss. I exercise, I eat healthy, and I make sure to get enough sleep so that I can stay healthy. If you think I'm involved in a lot of activities just to avoid thinking about grief, you are not correct. I'm doing it to tackle that grief head on by making choices that help me control my life. Grief is not the boss of me, even when those waves of it sometimes catch me by surprise and splash all over me. I accept that it'll show up every now and then, but I get to choose what to do about it. So my advice to you is don't let those waves knock you down. Get engaged in activities with other people. Do something to help others. Maybe you already are, but take it further if you can. Be willing to let the grief go, even if only for a little while. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you.